Our plans to go electric on land, air and sea to meet Singapore's green goals have been announced.
And efforts also to go car-lite, such as turning some of our roads into pedestrian-only areas. And for more on this, we have Transport Minister S Iswaran in the studios. Minister, thank you so much for coming in.
Good evening.
To chat to us today. Our roads have been very, sort of heavily focused on supporting vehicle use for a very long time. But we're retooling that now. We're sort of changing the way in which we use our roads. And we've got these people-friendly initiatives. How important is improving livability in our neighborhoods?
Well, I think you used the right word, retooling. We sometimes use the term repurposing. And the reason is quite simple. Firstly, in a land-constrained place like Singapore, it's quite clear that universal car ownership is not something we can achieve. So we have to make sure urban mobility is made as accessible, as convenient as possible. And when we've been conducting these Forward Singapore dialogues, for example, one of the things that comes across very strongly is a great appreciation for our public transport system, but at the same time, the desire for more inclusivity and first mile, last mile connectivity. That's where things like friendly streets, cycling initiatives, more pedestrian access type of facilities come in. Because what it then enables us to do is really facilitate a greater modal share, if you like, for public transport, which has benefits quite apart from convenience. There's also, of course, the environmental benefits because the carbon footprint is far lower.
Right.
All right. I'll pick you up from there since you mentioned environmental benefits. And this tweak that will take place in May, if essentially we change the conditions for which electric vehicles can fall under the so-called Category A COE premiums. Essentially, you see more cars falling under A as opposed to B, and in principle, therefore, more EVs becoming relatively more affordable to more people. That's welcome, of course. But sort of public feedback that we hear online is, well, should we not be doing more to tweak more fundamentally rather than just tweaking around the edges on Category A, Category B? What do you think about that?
So I think we need to be clear. The COE system fundamentally is about allocating a scarce resource. In this case, the available supply or quota for vehicles to the demand that exists out there. We have two categories, A and B, for the different types of cars, and then a Cat E, which is more, for general reallocation. So one of the things that we are very focused on is COE, whilst it's, as an allocative system, any incentives to promote particular types of vehicles should be then undertaken separately rather than be embedded in the COE system itself. And that is why, for example, we have the early adoption incentive for those who buy electric vehicles. So that reduces the upfront cost of buying an electric vehicle. We've also done this resizing the power output in order to make the COA system more fit for purpose, because there are a lot of what would be sort of mainstream cars, but because electric vehicles have a higher power output, they tend to then sometimes get categorized in the higher Cat B. So we've been able to reset that. And I think when you look at it overall, the outcomes have been quite positive. The adoption rates for EVs, if you look at last year, was about 11.8% of new cars. And that is more than 3 times what it was in the previous year when it was about 3.8%. So I think the adoption rates are growing, plus with the proliferation of charging infrastructure in HDB estates as well as in condominiums, I think we'll see greater adoption rates.
The infrastructure being put in place, notwithstanding, the number of people who can own or will own an EV will be in the absolute minority in Singapore's future. I want to ask you about something you said in Parliament today. Public transport ridership has recovered 90%, about 90% of pre-COVID levels in January this year. It's still stabilizing, the landscape is. But the transport sector hasn't been spared this issue of the labour shortage. We're seeing fewer drivers and so on. What can we really do about that in terms of this last mile a sort of solution for people who are traveling?
So the public transport system is actually a very important piece of the overall land transport architecture, because if you just look at it from a carbon footprint perspective, it's quite stark. Compared to driving an internal combustion engine car, if we choose to take the MRT for the same journey, our carbon footprint drops by 90%. So that's quite stark. That doesn't mean that we therefore cannot use cars, but what it does mean is our choices must be informed by the consequences, and we need to know this. So what we're trying to do is really make public transport in the form of our MRT system, our buses, and then the last mile, first mile connectivity as convenient as possible. So this is where a combination of strategies is there. And one of the big things we're doing is, of course, investing in our MRT infrastructure, for example. So in the next 10 years, we will increase our MRT system by 100 kilometers from today's 250. So that's a significant increase. And in terms of carbon footprint, transport sector accounts for about 15% of our carbon emissions nationally. This is one of the reasons why electrification, not just of the private cars, but also public bus. So we want to take half of our public bus fleet of about 6,000 electric by the end of the decade.
Right. So you're ramping up quite significantly the number of electric buses by next year. You're going from 60 to 400.
That's right. So that's the first tranche of tenders that LTA is calling. And they will build on that, because we need to get to something like 3,000 by the end of the decade. But doing it in this tranched manner, what it allows us to do is also gain more experience before we scale up at the national level.
Right. Minister, thank you very much for coming into the studios and chatting to us about all of these great new initiatives for public transportation and where we're going with our green initiatives as well for the transport sector.
Thank you.
Thank you.